Bibliophiles of the internet. Recently, there's been a lot of excitement about space travel, what with the success of the Project Hail Mary adaptation and the Artemis 2 mission. So I thought I would embrace that energy and recommend some cool sci-fi books about exploring space. So these are all books that I have personally read and would recommend. They're not just sci-fi books because sci-fi is a very broad umbrella term, but they are specifically about space, space travel, space exploration, and they are either set entirely or mostly in space. I pretty much went through every book I've read in the past 5 or 6 years, pulled out the titles I thought fit those parameters, and then narrowed it down to my favorites or the ones I felt most strongly about. So yes, there are definitely more books than just these that fit the brief, which you are more than welcome to share and recommend in the comments, but these are just some that I have read myself. With all that said, I'm going to start with a more recent release, which is If All the Stars Go Dark by S.G. Prince. This is a really fun, queer YA sci-fi adventure story. It's about Keller, who spent his entire life training to be a gunner in hopes of getting himself recruited to the most prestigious galactic unit in the Legion. But when he finally gets called up to join, it's only because his new pilot's last gunner was tragically killed in action. So his new pilot, Lament, wants nothing to do with him as he's still very much grieving his gunner, who also happened to be his best friend. But the two of them are forced to work together under Legion orders, and along with a motley crew, they set out to investigate a mysterious visionary who claims to be able to foresee catastrophes. Speaking for myself, I had a great time reading this. It's fun, it's got a great romantic subplot, it's adventurous, it's action-packed, it's fast-paced, it's very easy to get swept up in because you're dropped right into the action, and the pace does not let up until the very end. I also appreciate that it has worthwhile things to say about how much trust we put or don't put into technological advancements that we don't fully understand, and how we go about straddling the line between skepticism and optimism when it comes to those forms of progress. So really strong themes, but also fun and exciting and romantic. A duology I read last year and really loved was The Darkness Outside Us and the Brightness Between Us by Elliot Schreffer. This is a queer YA sci-fi duology that begins on a spaceship that's been deployed on an emergency rescue mission in response to a distant distress signal coming from another spacecraft that humankind sent out to establish a human colony in space. Ambrose, one of the main characters, was specifically chosen for this mission. The problem is he has no memory of the launch itself, and as he's slowly regaining his bearings, he's realizing that he may not be the only person aboard this ship. These are both really great sci-fi thrillers that also throw you right into the deep end on the very first page, and the question of what the fuck is actually going on is really the driving force behind the story. Gradually getting more and more context about what is objectively happening to the characters is a huge part of what this story is. Honestly, this is a very ambitious duology that plays with a ton of really compelling and complex ideas. There's an organic sense of urgency and intensity that this kind of survival story really lends itself to, and I just think both books are fantastic. Another book I referenced recently because I read its sequel in February is Hamajang Luck by Makana Yamamoto. This is a sci-fi heist written by a queer native Hawaiian author and pitched as Blade Runner meets Ocean's 8. It's about a non-binary Hawaiian character named Edie who just got done serving 8 years in prison after being sold out by Angel, their former partner in crime and now ex. Little does Edie know that their early parole has actually been orchestrated by Angel herself, who now works as the head of security for the most powerful trillionaire on the space station, and she wants Edie's help to pull off one last job that will take this trillionaire down for good. This is another high-octane, high-energy, high-stakes story. I think it does a great job of balancing character development and the crew dynamic with actual preparation and logistics concerning the heist itself. As you might be able to guess, it also has huge eat-the-rich, anti-capitalist energy, which I love. It has a super chaotic oops-all-lesbians cast who are really fun to read about, so overall just a pretty cool take on a space heist. There's also Volatile Memory by Seth Haddon, which would be a very timely read considering that its sequel, Null Entity, is coming out relatively soon on July 21st. But Volatile Memory is another fast-paced sci-fi thriller. It's a novella set in a distant future intergalactic empire in space where people use these high-tech masks that are fashioned after different animals, and depending on the animal, they can give the user special superhuman skills. The story follows a trans woman named Willa who works as a scavenger tracking down rare tech to sell on the black market, and one day she intercepts a distress beacon that leads her directly to an incredibly rare mask. But of course she's not the only person who's picked up on this signal, and to make things even more complicated, she also discovers that there appears to be a human consciousness fused into the mask. Not only is this a thrilling sci-fi adventure that follows our characters on a wild cat and mouse chase across the galaxy, but I think it has some some really interesting things to say about the very trans experience of embodying multiplicity and containing infinite possibilities all at once. It's asking some really compelling questions about what it means to have a body, what it means to exist in a body, what kinds of politics and limitations are projected onto our bodies, where we define the boundaries of where human experience begins and ends, and I'm really interested to see how the sequel continues exploring those ideas. On a very different note, I also quite enjoy the Dorothy Gentleman novella series from Olivia Waite. These are queer, cozy sci-fi mysteries that take place aboard this luxury generation ship known as the HMS Fairweather, which has been designed to transport humans to a new distant planet in space. One of the new technologies aboard this ship that makes this long journey possible is the fact that passengers can have their memories carefully stored in library books, and if anything happens to their bodies, if they happen to pass away en route, their memories can be transferred to a new body, and that allows them to survive the journey. Our main character, Dorothy Gentleman, is one of the ship's detectives, and not only does she wake up in a body that is decidedly not hers and that she did not authorize, but she also learns that someone has been killed, and not only were they killed, but their memory book was also destroyed in the process. I love how Olivia Waite has reimagined societal norms aboard this generation ship and is really exploring how social consciousness, including our ideas of what is moral and immoral, might shift if more of our social needs were actually being met. There are so many interesting ideas about how the citizens aboard this ship think about public safety, crime, the justice system, the accumulation of wealth, the concept of procreation, and so much more. And at the same time, there's a compelling yet relatively low-stakes mystery at the center of each installment. I think both books in this series so far have been really cool thought experiments with the air of a classic mystery at the center, and I really can't wait to see where the series goes next. Speaking of generation ships, I couldn't make this list without talking about one of my longtime faves, An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. This is a queer Afrofuturist story about a character named Aster who spent her whole life living in the low-deck slums of the HSS Matilda, a spaceship that's been unsuccessfully seeking what they call the Promised Land for generations. The ship has actually taken on a hierarchy that reflects the antebellum South, with white people living in comfort on the upper decks and all the black and brown people working the fields on the lower decks. After becoming embroiled in a grudge with a brutal overseer, Aster learns there may be a way to improve her lot in life and escape this ship for good, if she's willing to take the risk of igniting a civil war that could very well destroy everything and everyone she's ever known. I consider this to be a foundational text as far as space operas and generation ship stories go. It came out almost a decade ago, I read it almost a decade ago, and I still find myself thinking about it to this day. Aster as a character is a really great grounding force and driving force for the story, and the story also gives you a lot to consider in relation to how knowing your history and your origins is an incredibly powerful thing, something so powerful that oppressed people are purposely kept from being able to access that kind of knowledge, and how that can become a true proponent of revolution and resistance. Taking a more horrific angle on the concept of a doomed generation ship, I would also recommend The Scourge Between Stars by Ness Brown. This is a queer sci-fi horror novella about Jack, who is the acting captain of the Calypso and responsible for keeping what's left of humankind alive as they try to return to Earth after failing to initiate a human colony on a distant planet. But of course, their ship was not built to make a two-way trip across the galaxy, so they're running out of food and resources, they might not have enough fuel, their ship is heavily damaged with no way to make long-term repairs, and what's left of the crew is being pushed to the breaking point. But as unrest continues to rise, they realize that some kind of unknown creature has boarded the ship and is beginning to pick off the remaining crew members one by one. This is another gripping, fast-paced sci-fi novella, and I think the payoff is absolutely worth the price of admission, especially considering that it requires very little time investment. I love a good action-packed creature feature, and that's exactly what this is, but also set in the dead void of space. When all is said and done, this story is about a badass queer black woman who refuses to give up even though she's faced with countless impossible choices every which direction she looks, and I just think that's a huge part of what makes this so exciting and cool to read. Another book that I think fits this brief is Some Desperate Glory by Emily Tesh. This is a queer military space opera about Kier, who's been raised her entire life on a space station known as Gaia Station after Earth and most of humankind was destroyed at the hands of an alien race. It's basically a military station where everyone is assigned very specific roles and rigorously trained in combat basically from birth, and Kier just happens to be one of the best warriors of her generation. So after being incredibly faithful to the system her entire life, you can imagine her surprise when her brother is not only relegated to certain death, but she is also assigned to the nursery as the child bearer of the next generation. In fact, she's so certain that there's been some kind of grave mistake that she decides to take humanity's revenge into her own hands. When I look back on this book, the number one thing I think about is how it displays one of the most epic, incredible character arcs for the main character that I have possibly ever read. It shows her going from someone so staunchly invested in this militant system, believing that the way the system works is inherently correct and righteous, to being radicalized and reckoning with the role that she's played in upholding that system and acting as a conduit for its corruption. It has a lot to say about how humans willingly consent to horrible things as long as those horrible things benefit us, and it really goes in depth on what it means to break those cycles and free ourselves from those systems. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Nine Fox Gambit by the one and only Yoon Ha Lee. This is another military space opera about a disgraced captain named Calcheris, who's being punished for using what's referred to as unconventional tactics in the ongoing war against the heretics. To redeem herself, she's been ordered to retake the Fortress of Scattered Needles, but before she does, her body will forcibly be made into a vessel for the undead soul of a ruthless tactician named Shuos Jidao, who never once lost a battle, but also famously massacred not one, but two armies, including his own. I love this trilogy so much. It has its haters and its naysayers like you would not believe, but as I always say, while the series does explore a complex and richly imagined sci-fi world, it is not unknowable or indecipherable by any stretch of the imagination. Not only does it have really cool mathematical-based sci-fi technologies, but it's also blending elements of horror and possession at the same time, which I think very uniquely positions it within the sci-fi genre. I truly cannot recommend it enough. I would also recommend The Genesis of Misery by Neon Yang. This is another queer sci-fi space opera pitched as Joan of Arc in space, which I think honestly might be the perfect pitch. The main character, Misery, is from a middle-of-nowhere planet, but she somehow possesses the stone-working powers of a saint. But there's an unfortunate side effect to these powers, which are all-consuming hallucinatory episodes known colloquially as void madness. So to avoid scrutiny, Misery has always hidden her abilities. But then one day the voice of an angel, or possibly a very convincing hallucination, leads Misery to the heart of this galactic empire where they find themselves trapped between two powerful factions who both want to use Misery's powers to win a terrible war. This story is so chaotic, so mind-melting in the best possible way, and just really fucking cool. It has that X factor. It also has mecha warfare, which is like inherently badass. And to top it off, it's about this disaster trans main character openly masquerading as the Messiah and manipulating two warring factions to do their own bidding regardless of the consequences. And that's just the kind of chaotic shit that I love. There's only one middle grade book that I've read that I think really fits the bill here, and that would be The Last Cuentista by Donna Barba Higuera. This is a middle grade Latinx sci-fi story that takes place in the distant future when it's been predicted that Earth will be destroyed by a comet, and only a few hundred scientists and their families have been chosen to journey to a new planet and carry on the human race. The main character, Petra, is one of the few chosen ones, and after about 300 years in cryosleep, she wakes up to discover that something has gone horribly wrong. There is a sinister entity known as the Collective aboard this ship that has been systematically erasing everyone's memories of the past. But there was some kind of malfunction with Petra's pod, and now she is the only person on board who remembers Earth and all of its stories. I would say this story definitely leans more on the side of hope punk than anything else. While it sounds very dark and lonely for such a young person to be quote-unquote burdened with carrying on the legacy of Earth and humankind, the story is more so about how Petra can combine her knowledge with her love of storytelling to hopefully bring people back to themselves. And I think it's also a powerful rumination on how preserving history doesn't necessarily mean repeating the same stories and ideas exactly as they've always been told, but rather finding new ways to tell familiar stories that meet the current moment. And I think lastly for today, I would also recommend a more recent release called Of Monsters and Mainframes by Barbara Truelove. This is a really interesting mashup of sci-fi and classic horror. It's told from the perspective of a supercomputer-powered spaceship known as the Demeter, whose job is to shuttle humans back and forth between Earth and other planets. Unfortunately, all of her passengers keep dying absolutely horrific deaths before reaching their destination, and Demeter can't figure out why. The company that owns her is ready to decommission her and scrap her for parts, but Demeter and a very strange collective collection of passengers are determined to prove that these deaths were actually caused by a vampire stowing away on board. This story is so campy, so delightful, so adventurous. It takes the familiar concept of a space opera and a space survival story and tells it from a very unique point of view, a very limited point of view, with this spaceship who is not programmed to interface with organic creatures and doesn't have a body or even freedom of movement. So the story has to be very clever and creative in how she's able to maneuver and investigate. There's also an endearing element of found family, a great cast of characters, a creative take on classic monster archetypes, so there's just a lot here to enjoy. So there you have it. Those are a handful of my favorite books about space, space travel, space discovery. There's so much more I didn't even get to touch on, like Ancillary Justice, Winter's Orbit, How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, etc. Again, if you have more recommendations to share, definitely drop those down below in the comments. But that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.